The story in my head writes itself for 17 hours. Once I wrote a letter to a story on page 17, and once I was 17, and there were approximately 17 reasons that I might spell out Seventeen instead of simply writing 17. That is one of the stories in my head right now. Or several hours after it happened, when I ended up back at the garage because my car smelled like gas from where they bled the brake lines, and I hope that's all it is because they looked it over thoroughly, and I was waiting in the room with the man and the television, which was impossible not to look at, and the surreality of knowing that the reporter I was watching was being filmed half a mile away, and the younger woman, blonde, in one of the rooms at the station talking about social media and the role it played, and photos from smartphones in the parking lot, and the Twitter account of the man that said, "There's no way to know what to do when something like this happens again. #helpless, #helpless, #helpless." So this is not the talk I intended to give today. I'm a writer. I have a lot to say about story. I had it all figured out in my head. I had a lot of different things figured out in my head, and I'd even practiced them, and 2 weeks ago, I was half a mile away from a school shooting in Christiansburg, and I witnessed the whole thing going down. And the very first rehearsal that we had for these TED Talks was the day of the bombings in Boston. And so I showed up not knowing if my partner had a friend who was running in that marathon or not. And I made it too easy on myself, and it didn't flow, and it wasn't right, and I was told, "You'll have an epiphany," and I did. And the epiphany was this, that this was the talk that I had to give. I could start here. Here where the police cars began speeding past, the ambulances, the SWAT team, city cops, county cops, blue and gray state vehicles with frantic lights and siren after siren, and then the helicopters, all of the mechanics stepping outside of the garage, watching the parade of rescue vehicles, pulling out their phones and calling again, watching, speculating only briefly because it was all there within seconds, within minutes, within the time it took for me to pull out my phone. I was sitting under a tree and I moved to the bench. The welder worked on a Jeep that had a sticker on it that said, "Dog is love, sparks flew." That is part of the story in my head yesterday. So when something really extreme happens, when there is a crisis or a trauma, everything gets really vivid and kind of shiny around the edges. And what happens to me is that I start to notice details. And sometimes it's the details of what's happening, and sometimes it's the way my fingers feel on the porch railing as I'm walking down the stairs, or the fact that there's a bumper sticker on a car that says "Dog is love," although anybody here who knows me would tell you that I would notice something like bumper stickers because I have a lot of bumper stickers on my car. What most people here wouldn't know is that I didn't have any bumper stickers on my car until 12 years ago because my husband didn't like bumper stickers. He felt like he'd rather be more incognito and, kind of go under the radar. And so I didn't put any bumper stickers on my car until he died. And the very first bumper sticker was, "The only constant is change." Sam was the mechanic who figured out that it was the strut that had collapsed and shredded my old tire. He showed me the damage only a few minutes before. Sam was the man with a wife in the classroom where they hid, and the shooter walked in and didn't see them and walked out, and they escaped out the side door into the same lights and sirens that had just sped by the garage. Sam showed me the damage. It was rusted through. Sam called his wife, who was there and being held for questioning. Sam brought me the ruined strut and showed me the places it was broken. Sam said, "See, this is where," and I stopped Sam and I said, "Sam, is your wife okay?" And Sam set the strut down. Sam told me he owned guns. His wife was still being held for questioning. He said he didn't understand. He pointed at his head. "It's not the guns," he said, "it's up here." His wife was still being held for questioning when the new strut was installed and Sam shook my hand goodbye. His wife was still being held for questioning. Sam is one of the stories in my head right now. So Sam became my story. It wasn't my story, it was Sam's story, but I was with Sam, and so Sam became my story, and I would imagine that I became part of Sam's story as well, because I was the woman that was held up at the garage because her strut had rusted through. Sam's story was filtered through mine, which was also the story of my brother being close enough to Virginia Tech in 2008 to hear the gunshots, and who had a friend who was shot in the shoulder and pretended to be dead, and that was the only way that he survived. We have filters, we have contact points. We become each other's stories when we listen to each other closely. A bright April day after rain, swift muddy water and a blue, blue sky, fruit trees that will not bear fruit, decorating the town streets with bloom, the impossibly fragile green of a brand new weeping willow. The time I talked to my therapist about the chestnut blossoms and the smell of them and the feeling of imminent trauma, I don't remember April in this way. Chestnuts are July. Most of this is July. Some of this is December. Some of this is running down the driveway. April is the classroom and the loop at Hollins, and sitting in my car for 15 minutes watching the crows hop up and down the short wooden fence that separated the parking loop from the soccer field. I couldn't go in right away. I couldn't turn off NPR, the classroom, and the day that should not be the day. Residual gunfire disguised as a prop, as support for every door on campus in case someone is trying to get in. And my meeting with my thesis advisor, where the housekeeping staff brought him the steel bar to place under the knob and showed him how to use it, and then we were supposed to go back then to talking about poetry? The time I talked to my therapist about the chestnut blossoms, and he told me that the brain makes pathways related to trauma, that it sends synaptic connections out to sensory stimulus, and that knowing this might help me bear the triggers. I think of fingers on triggers. I think of classrooms. I think of a bright April day after rain, swift muddy water, and a blue, blue sky, fruit trees that will not bear fruit decorating the town streets with bloom, the impossibly fragile green of a brand new weeping willow. This story plays on and on and on through my head with minor variations. But there's more to this story. Because we don't have to try to remember trauma. Our brain has a negativity bias. It's wired to remember the things that could protect us. So in order to remember the things that bring us joy, in order to remember the things that make us happy, we have to stop. And we have to notice, just for a minute or two. And it helps that 1/3 of our brain that remembers those good things, remember them. And sometimes this is all the more crucial in the middle of crisis. We came home. I hugged my daughter. We brought in the groceries. The dogs were ecstatic to see us. I hugged my partner over and over, washed dishes while she steamed asparagus and concocted the rest of supper. I called my friend. We talked about how much life had to offer, for better or worse. I contemplated a different response. Adrenaline seeped out of me and made my tea bitter. I could feel it leaving. The dogs were ecstatic to see us. She steamed asparagus while I washed dishes. The phone rang again and again. Actually, I think she steamed the new potatoes, blue and red and gold, and sautéed the asparagus in butter. I washed the dishes. Some of them are still washed this morning. They are not put away yet. This story is the everyday story, the story that is still the story while the other story writes itself. So we tell each other our story all the time. We're making it up as we go along. Whether or not we think we are, we have an idea in our head of the story that we're living, and when that's stopped, when it's interrupted, it becomes very hard to find the next part of the narrative. And sometimes it's a matter of going back to that same story over and over and over again. And when I first began therapy, I was frustrated because I kept feeling like I was scraping off the scab. Like, why do I have to do this? Why do I have to tell this? It's just re-injuring myself. And my therapist, who had worked a lot with children, told me about a young girl who had lost her home in a fire, and she hadn't spoken for about 2 months. And when they brought her in, she would go to the dollhouse and she would set up her family in the way they were the night of the fire. And then the fire engine would come, and the family would go out of the house, and it would go away. And she did this over and over again for 5 or 6 weeks until she finally started talking again. Not long after that, I remembered tying my daughter's shoes. It was a part of the story I'd never told. It never seemed important. And I can't tell you why that was the piece that was important, but that was the part of the story I had to tell. While I sat in the car trying to recall what we needed at the grocery store, this story wrote itself in the heat of the late afternoon sun, greenhousing the windshield. A young girl, maybe 2 or 3, was crying and trying to launch herself out of the shopping cart in front of us. She wanted to walk. Her mother kept telling her to pull herself together. Later, in the dairy section, she'd been left with her father while she finished crying, and she wouldn't sit next to him. Her faltering sobs shook her body, and her father randomly threatened her with spankings or an early bedtime if she didn't stop her tears. I couldn't listen. I almost cried myself, and I knew I was fixating unnecessarily, and it didn't help when we were checking out, and her father walked by holding her. She'd finally stopped crying, and her mother glanced at me and shook her head with that, "Oh, you look like a mother too, and what are we going to do with our kids?" kind of look, and a rueful smile. And I wanted to follow her. I wanted to say, this is her normal. I wanted to say, sometimes you let them walk when they want to walk. I wanted to say, this is what she'll know forever. Have to retrain herself to feel, have to understand that sometimes the only thing you can do is cry when there's a helplessness surrounding you and you do not have your own feet. I did not smile back. I looked down at my credit card and reminded myself that I needed to stop by the bank on the way home. I wanted to go home. I wanted my own feet. This story circulates. This story has feet and a childlike trust that the people who love it will let it walk when it wants to. So, there are a lot of reasons that story is important. We communicate. We have this ongoing narrative. It's the way that we live. It's the way that we exist. It's a means of existence. It's how we construct our lives. I can tell you that the car smelled like gas because we had a can of Fix-A-Flat in the back, and when the mechanic threw the tire in after fixing them, it was not secured properly, and it bumped the can of Fix-A-Flat, which spewed all over the back of our car, and we didn't figure that out for a couple of days, and I didn't know that Fix-A-Flat smells exactly like gasoline. So that was a relief. Is that important? I have no idea. I do know that a lot of times our stories become so important that when we engage with other people, we're really engaging with their stories. And sometimes, when you really are willing to trust and when you know somebody really well, you're actually engaging with them. But for the most part, it's about our stories. So we need to make sure they're real. We need to make sure they're ours. And I can't tell you why your story is important. I can only tell you that it is. My mind doesn't stop often enough. I quit trying to make it. The story writes itself across the moment. It lingers along the edges. It helps to organize each thought into lyric portions, edible rationalizations, and the metaphor, the eternal metaphor, when a traffic light changes or the river becomes a creek as we drive upstream. Experience becomes another, and I am aware of the thin soles of my old shoes on the cracked asphalt. A tree limb broken in last night's storm. Lack of fatality. I am aware of my breath and breathing in compassion, breathing out compassion. I leave the bench and return to the tree. I distract myself briefly with a novel, knowing that this one will go down in my mind like the girl who loved Tom Gordon on the first night after my husband died, and I didn't sleep till briefly right at dawn. I find the irony in the final chapter of The Hunger Games. I needed the darkness and another awful story to tell myself about myself before the words began to form. Words into worlds. I write my way through it again, and this is only 17 hours, only 19 hours now, only N-I-N-E-T-E-E-N. I will plant persimmons, hoping they will not catch cold in late frost. I will move myself out of this chair and into the arms of my kindred, who told me in no uncertain terms yesterday that I was loved. I will let myself be loved. I will not bend or bow to comparisons, instead being grateful for the tire that got me there, the presence I could be, the grease and the sirens and the rapid acceleration of my still beating heart. I will know that there is still breakfast to be made and dishes to be put away. I will know that we can change this. I will know what I can and cannot overcome. I will accommodate the commendation and relinquish the crazy half rhythms of little songs, #helpless, muttering cash. It will all blend into this, and it will continue. Thank you so much.